more honestly than felt safe, because something about the way he listened made honesty feel like the only reasonable response. Purely financial, I told him when he asked about catering. I'm trying to finish my design degree. Something shifted in his face, not pity. Something more careful than pity. What kind of design? Textile. Fashion, the kind nobody believes pays real money until it does. For a moment he just looked at me, not the way men look at women at galas. Not that surveying kind of attention, but the way someone looks when they are genuinely recalibrating what they thought they were dealing with. Like I had surprised him, like he hadn't expected to find someone worth surprising in that corner of that evening. My 9 o'clock alarm went off. After apologizing, I picked up my tray and walked away from Dominic Hale, telling myself firmly that was the end of that. The universe found that very funny. 3 days later, a handwritten note arrived at the catering company's front desk addressed to me by full name, asking if I would be willing to meet for coffee. No title on the envelope, no company letterhead, just my name, his number, and 4 words underneath. I'd like to talk. Throwing it away would have been the right move. Calling the number on that note took 3 attempts before I actually let it ring. The first 2 times, I hung up before it connected. Standing in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, still in my uniform from a late shift, arguing with myself the way women argue when they already know what they want to do but are hoping logic will talk them out of it. On the 3rd attempt, I sat down, pressed call, and waited. He picked up on the 2nd ring, like he had been expecting it, like he had never doubted I would call. Something about that should have told me everything. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became a walk along the waterfront that lasted 3 hours longer than either of us planned. Questions nobody had ever bothered asking came from him naturally. About my grandmother's fabric shop back home, about the sketchbooks I filled at 19, about what I wanted my life to look like in 10 years. And I answered, honestly, more honestly than felt safe. Because something about the way he listened made honesty feel like the only reasonable response. By the 4th week, I was in love. That timeline matters. 4 weeks. Not because I was foolish. I need you to understand that. But because what we had in those early weeks felt more real than anything I had touched in years. Dominic was present, attentive. He remembered everything. The name of my favorite fabric supplier. The professor who had failed my thesis proposal, the shade of blue I once said, reminded me of my mother's kitchen curtains, every detail. Remembered outside those stolen evenings, though, his life looked nothing like the man sitting across from me at quiet corner tables. What I did not know, what I could not have known from inside, was that Dominic Hale was already someone else's future husband. Let me stay for just a little longer in the part that was still beautiful. Shadows were where our relationship lived from the very beginning, though I told myself that was simply discretion. He was a public figure. Walking into his company's charity events hand in hand was never going to happen. I was a caterer he had met at one of those very events, and the optics, as he explained once carefully, were complicated. So we met in restaurants tucked into neighborhoods neither of us belonged to, hotel lobbies in cities we had both traveled to for unrelated reasons. My apartment, once, twice, then regularly, always late, always through the back entrance of my building because the front faced a street where photographers sometimes waited near the coffee shop 2 doors down. Every word of that explanation I believed. Because when you love someone, you translate their red flags into love languages. You call secrecy protection. You call absence patience. You call the fact that you have never once met a single person from his actual life. Not a colleague, not a friend, not a family member. You call that privacy and you hold it carefully, like it is something he has gifted you rather than something he is using to contain you. 3 months On a Tuesday evening in October, I found out I was pregnant. 40 minutes on the bathroom floor of my apartment, alone, just me and a test, and the silence of a life splitting into a before and after. Terror was there. Underneath the terror, something I didn't have a name for yet, something that felt almost like certainty, like my body had decided something the rest of me hadn't caught up to. Friday was when I planned to tell him. Before I tell you what happened next, and I need you to stay with me, because this is where everything changes, go ahead and subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button, because what I found on Thursday, the day before I planned to tell Dominic he was going to be a father, is the kind of thing that will make you want to throw something across the room. And I don't want you to miss a single second of what comes after it Thursday morning. Phone in hand during my lunch break, scrolling through nothing in particular, the mindless kind of scrolling you do when your brain needs a rest from itself. A headline stopped me cold. Dominic Hale, CEO of Hale Consolidated, announces engagement to Simone Arsenault following 2 years together. 2 years, 4 times I read it, and the words didn't change. Looking at the photograph, I saw him smiling. That same slow, genuine smile I thought belonged to me. Standing beside a woman in cream silk, tall, composed, the kind of beautiful that gets described as elegant rather than pretty. She was holding his hand. He was holding hers. The caption said the announcement had been planned for months. Months, our entire relationship had existed inside an engagement he never mentioned. Every dinner, every hotel lobby, every late night at my back entrance. All of it had been happening while he was, publicly, officially, already belonging to someone else. Somewhere inside me, new and small and entirely unaware of any of this, was his child. If you have ever loved someone who made you feel chosen, truly, completely chosen, and then discovered you were never even on the official list, you already know what the floor of that lunch break felt like beneath my feet. Morning came the day after I saw that announcement, and his call came with it. Not to explain. Not to apologize. Dominic called to ask if we could meet. His penthouse Saturday at noon, and his voice on the phone was the same it had always been. Measured, unhurried, the voice of a man who had already decided how the conversation would go before it started. Almost, I didn't go. Standing in front of my wardrobe that Saturday morning, one hand resting on my stomach without thinking, I made myself a promise before walking out the door. Whatever he said, I would not cry in front of him. Buildings like that one don't have visible addresses from the street. Just a black door, a keypad, and a uniformed man who checked my name against a list before stepping aside without a word. The elevator required a key card. Carpeting on the 43rd floor ran so thick that my footsteps made no sound at all, which felt in retrospect like the building itself was designed to swallow evidence. The door opened before I knocked. Not Dominic. A woman in a gray blazer holding a leather portfolio stepped aside and introduced herself as his personal counsel, gesturing me inside with practiced warmth, the kind belonging to someone whose job it is to make uncomfortable things feel administrative. Walking in, I felt the room open up around me, floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. The city spread 43 floors below like something that belonged to someone. At the far end of a long table that could seat 20, Dominic Hale sat with 2 more people I didn't recognize, both with folders open, both looking at me the way doctors look at scans, not at a person. At a situation, standing when I entered, Dominic wore a charcoal suit and an expression I had never seen on him before. Not cold exactly, but evacuated. Like he had removed himself from behind his own eyes and left something professional in his place. Around the table he did not come. Gesturing to the chair directly across from him, he indicated the seat that had clearly been positioned with intention. isolated, facing the panel, slightly lower than I realized until I sat down and felt it. Adriana, just my name, no preamble. You have lawyers here, I said. I do. For a conversation. For clarity, he replied. So there's no misunderstanding about what's being offered and what the expectations are going forward. Right there was the first confirmation that whatever I thought we had built across those 3 months had never, not once, been the same thing to both of us. To me, it had been a relationship. To him, it had been a situation. Situations in the world Dominic Hale occupied got managed, contained, resolved by people with leather portfolios and practiced warmth and chairs positioned slightly lower than the ones on the other side of the table. His counsel opened her portfolio. 4 pages. That is what it took to end a life. I remember that with a clarity that has never faded. A figure sat at the top of the second page that I will not repeat here, because the number is not the point. Beneath it, language so clean and carefully constructed that you almost missed what it was actually saying. Page 3, paragraph 2 stated clearly that acceptance of the outline support was contingent upon the recipient choosing not to proceed with the current pregnancy. Looking up from the paper, I met his eyes. Dominic watched me, still evacuated, still sitting with his hands flat on the table like a man in full control of a meeting he had called. "Keep that child," he said, his voice carrying no shake, no rise, no tremor of the man who had once remembered the exact shade of blue of my mother's kitchen curtains, "and I will make sure you have nothing left worth holding on to. Your design program, your references, every door in this industry you have not yet opened, I will close them. Permanently." That is not a threat, Adriana. It is a projection, based on what I am capable of, which I think by now you understand. Silence filled the room completely. Outside the glass, 43 floors below, the city moved the way cities move, indifferent, continuous, unbothered by what was being dismantled inside this room at this altitude. Looking at the document, then the lawyers, then the man across the table who had 11 weeks ago held my hand in a restaurant booth and asked what shade of blue reminded me of home. I made my decision. Standing up, I said nothing. No document taken, nothing signed, no tears. I had made myself that promise and I kept it, and it is one of the few things from that afternoon I am still proud of. Pushing the chair back, I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. Adriana. His voice one final time, stopping. I did not turn around. "You are making a decision you cannot undo. So are you," I said without turning, without raising my voice, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing my face. Walking out, I carried nothing but the child. Some men believe that power is the ability to make someone disappear. What they never account for is the woman who refuses to. 11 days later, I left the city, nothing dramatic about it. No midnight escape, no single bag thrown over a shoulder, no rain. Tuesday morning. A rented van, 2 boxes of books, a suitcase with a broken wheel I had been meaning to replace for 2 years, and my Aunt Celestine's address written on a folded paper in my coat pocket because I didn't trust my memory in the state I was in. 6 hours of driving. 1 stop for petrol and a bottle of water I didn't drink. Somewhere on that empty stretch of highway between and the one I hadn't built yet, I rolled down the window and let the cold air hit my face and said out loud, to nobody, to the road, to whatever was listening, "We are going to be fine," believing it fully would come later, saying it had to come first, because some things you have to speak before they become true. Waiting in a 2-bedroom house on a street lined with oak trees was my aunt. Sharp-tongued, soft-hearted, my mother's older sister, the kind of woman who opens the door before you knock because she heard your car turn onto her street 3 minutes ago and already has the kettle on. No questions came the first night. Jollof rice appeared. The spare room had clean sheets. and the hallway light went off at 10 o'clock. Never in months had I felt so loved. Everything came out the following morning at her kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug that said "World's Okayest Cook" in faded letters. Celestine listened without interrupting, which, if you know her, is a form of extraordinary discipline. When I finished, silence held for a long moment. Then she said, "So you're keeping it?" Not a question. "Yes," I said. One nod, the way women nod when they have already made their own peace with a decision and are simply confirming you've made yours. "Then we have work to do," she said, and stood up and refilled my mug without asking. Nothing more than that. No lecture, no list of concerns, no careful recitation of every risk and difficulty waiting ahead. Just, "We have work to do." Those 5 words have lived inside me across every year that followed, because that is exactly what she gave me. Not pity, not advice, a partner. Hard doesn't begin to describe a solo pregnancy, not dramatically, not in ways that make for good storytelling, but in the accumulation of small difficulties that have no audience and no resolution except endurance. Prenatal appointments, where the intake form had a line for emergency contact, and I wrote Celestine's name in handwriting steadier than I felt. Evenings when the baby kicked for the first time and there was nobody to grab by the arm and say, feel this right now. Those 3 a.m., moments of pure animal terror that couldn't be explained to anyone because they weren't about anything specific, just the vast, shapeless weight of what I had chosen and what it was going to cost. Endurance was the only currency that mattered. Somewhere inside it, something happened that I didn't expect. Quieter, I became. Not sadder, quieter. The version of me that had spent 3 months bending herself into the shape of Dominic Hale's schedule, his preferences, his need for discretion. That version started to dissolve. What replaced her was someone I recognized from a long time ago. Someone with opinions about things. Someone who took up space without apologizing for it. Some of you know exactly what I mean. You have been in a relationship or a situation because sometimes that is the more honest word that slowly, without announcing itself, started replacing pieces of you with pieces of what someone else needed you to be. And you didn't notice until you left, until the distance gave you enough room to look back and see the shape of what had been quietly hollowed out, room to breathe, room to remember, room to become. That is what the highway gave me. That is what those 6 months of building a new life in a city that did not know my name gave me back. Myself, part-time work at a fabric supplier, found me 3 weeks after arriving, which felt, on some days, like the universe making a small joke, and on other days, like something pointing forward. Online continuation of my design coursework came next. A second-hand sewing table went into the corner of the spare room. And slowly, the way you work when your body is growing something else and energy is a currency you budget carefully, creating started again. Never once did she say, "I told you so." Not once. Not across all those months. Labor started on a night in early spring. She drove me to the hospital at 2 in the morning without complaint, sat in the waiting room for 9 hours with a paperback novel and a thermos of tea, and when the nurse finally came out to find her, Celestine walked into my room, looked at the small, furious, perfect face of the boy in my arms, and said, "Lord have mercy, he's got his whole chest." Wrong about that, she was not. Furious was the only word for Marcus at 2 minutes old. Furious at the fluorescent lights, furious at the cold air, furious at the sheer inconvenience of existing outside of where he had been perfectly comfortable for 9 months. The nurse laughed. Against my chest I held him, this small, outraged, extraordinary person, and felt something settle inside me that had been loose and rattling around for the better part of a year. Not happiness, exactly. Something older than happiness. Something that didn't need a name, loud as a baby, quiet as a toddler. which Celestine said meant he was storing everything up, processing it, filing it somewhere internal for later use. By the time Marcus was 3, he would sit at the kitchen table with whatever was in front of him, a bowl of cereal, a set of mismatched buttons I kept in a jar, a folded piece of newspaper, and study it with a focus that felt less like childhood curiosity and more like professional assessment. The world he examined the way an engineer examines a structure, not wondering if it was beautiful, wondering how it worked. Why do shadows change size? 4 years old when he asked that. Quietly, almost to himself, he corrected the television at 5 during a nature documentary. The presenter had simplified something about tidal patterns, and Marcus, without looking up from the puzzle he was assembling, murmured, "That's not exactly right," in the tone of someone flagging a minor administrative error. Staring at him for a long moment, I made a decision. Every after-school program the district offered got his name on it. A savings account opened that same week, one I added to every month without fail, even in the months when adding meant rice and eggs for the last week before payday. Genuinely liked, not merely tolerated the way gifted children sometimes are, Marcus moved through school with a quality of fairness that other children sensed and trusted. Never more than his share of anything did he take. Names he remembered after hearing them once. Even at 7 and 8 years old, the instinct to notice who was left out of something and do something quiet about it lived naturally in him. Where that came from, I cannot say. It wasn't from his father. Here is the second thing I never told anyone about Dominic Hale. And I promised you 3 things at the start of this story, so stay with me. Across all the years of raising Marcus, there were moments when I saw flashes of Dominic in him. The stillness, the way he held a room without performing for it. That quality of attention when something genuinely interested him. Those flashes used to stop my breath, not because they made me miss Dominic. That particular feeling had burned through before Marcus said his first word. But because they reminded me that my son was carrying something inside him he had no context for. An inheritance he didn't know existed. From a man whose name I had never once spoken inside our home. Marcus asked about his father for the first time when he was 6, kitchen table. Homework spread between us, a maths worksheet he had already finished, and a reading assignment he was pointedly ignoring because the book was, in his words, not that interesting. Looking up, he met my eyes with those that were entirely his father's and entirely his own simultaneously, and said with the casual directness he applied to everything, "Mom, where's my dad?" Softly, devastatingly. That question landed. 12 different versions of an answer had been rehearsed across 6 years of anticipating that exact moment. What came out was none of them. "Your dad," I said carefully, was someone who wasn't ready to be one. Processing, filing, a moment of quiet consideration. "Was he mean to you?" Marcus asked. That precision, not was he bad, not did he leave, but was he mean to you, told me everything about the kind of person my son was becoming. He wasn't asking about himself. He was asking about me. "He made choices I didn't agree with," I said. "We went our separate ways, and I got you." So, nodding slowly, the way he nodded when he had received information and was deciding where to store it. "Okay," he said, picked up his pencil, went back to the maths worksheet, bepliling he never did. Not that day, and not for years afterward. Closed. The question wasn't. I knew that the way mothers know things that haven't been said yet, filed away in that internal place where Marcus kept everything that mattered, everything he was still working out, everything he would eventually return to when ready. At 22, he returned to it, in a boardroom on the 43rd floor of a building he now controlled. Right now, though, in the small house with the oak trees outside. and the sewing table in the spare room and the savings account fed every month without fail. Right now, Marcus was 7 years old, completely unaware of what the universe was quietly assembling around him. Without question, he was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Now let me show you the other side of those 22 years. While Adriana fed a savings account on rice and eggs, while Marcus corrected nature documentaries at 5 and asked questions that made grown adults reconsider everything, was winning. By every visible measure, by every metric that people in his world used to keep score, the man was winning comprehensively. Hardest part to sit with. That right there. Hale consolidated, expanded across 3 continents in the 7 years following Adriana's disappearance. Logistics, supply chain infrastructure, last-mile delivery networks. The kind of foundational industrial work that nobody photographs for magazines, but that every glamorous thing in the modern world quietly depends on. 2 business publications put him on their covers in that period. A TED Talk about ethical leadership received 4 million views. A library wing at his alma mater bore his name above the entrance in letters designed to outlast him. From the outside, it looked like a life without consequences. 4 years and 3 months. The length of the marriage to Simone Arsenault. No dramatic confrontation ended it. No thrown objects, no final conversation. Just a single email from her assistant informing Dominic's assistant that Simone had retained legal counsel and would be vacating the penthouse by the end of the following week. She left him for his CFO. Circulating quietly through the upper floors of Hale, consolidated for approximately 6 days, that detail eventually disappeared. Everyone decided simultaneously they had never heard it and certainly weren't going to be the one to mention it again. Monday, following Simone's departure, Dominic returned, wearing the same charcoal suit, carrying the same leather portfolio, with the same evacuated expression behind his eyes that Adriana had once seen across a boardroom table and understood meant the man she loved had already left the building. 9 o'clock meeting ran on schedule, 3 decisions made before lunch. Simone's name never crossed his lips. Quietly, without announcement, the cracks arrived. Serious structural damage always works beneath the surface, in places that don't show until the weight above them becomes too much to carry. First came the CFO's departure, who left with Simone, and, significantly, with 14 years of institutional knowledge about Hale Consolidated's financial architecture that proved considerably harder to replace than the man's job title suggested. Next came a competitor, a young logistic tech company out of the Midwest that nobody had taken seriously 18 months prior, which had somehow begun eating into their market share with speed and precision that felt less like competition and more like targeting. Last came the board. 3 members resigned in a single quarter. In the language of corporate governance, that is not a coincidence. That is a message. Translated from careful boardroom phrasing of strategic realignment and personal priorities, it reads simply, the people closest to the machinery of Dominic Hale's empire no longer fully believed in either the empire or the man running it. Control, strategy, and significant resources applied to the surface appearance of stability. His response to all 3 cracks, as always. A new CFO hired within 6 weeks. A competitive analysis report running to 200 pages with 11 strategic pivots, 4 implemented immediately. Individual meetings with every remaining board member, from each of which he emerged, having secured their confidence for at least another fiscal quarter, extraordinarily good at managing things. That was Dominic Hale. Managing the insomnia was another matter entirely. Beginning the year, Marcus would have turned 12. Not that Dominic knew that. Not that he had any way of knowing it. Not that he allowed himself to think in those terms consciously. Something in him started malfunctioning in the small hours of the morning. Waking at 3, at 4, at the formless hour belonging to no part of the day, lying in the darkness of his penthouse bedroom, his mind would travel to places he had spent a decade training it not to go, not regret. He would not have called it that curiosity about the conversation on the 43rd floor, about the way Adriana had stood from that deliberately lowered chair with more dignity than the room deserved, about those 3 words at the door. So are you, and how differently they sat in his chest at 43 than they had at 31. About whether there had been a child, in the way a man thinks about something when he will not fully admit he is thinking about it. Whether that child had her eyes, whether that child was somewhere, in that same dark hour, sleeping or waking or becoming something Dominic Hale had forfeited the right to witness. Finishing that thought, he never let himself. Not yet. Some men spend their whole lives calling their regrets by other names. Curiosity, pragmatism, the weight of responsibility. The language changes. The thing underneath it never does. 3 days before the merger meeting that would change everything, Marcus Hale Osei ironed his best suit on the floor of his apartment because he did not own an ironing board. Dressing for a reckoning, he did not yet know that, worth understanding, that detail. The suit, the floor, the ironing board he hadn't gotten around to buying because something more urgent always needed that $40. Not the Forbes profile, not the acquisition figure, not the venture capital firm's press release describing him as one of the most consequential logistics minds of his generation. The suit on the floor of a man who had built something extraordinary and still hadn't bought an ironing board, that is the real biography. Back further, though, because Marcus's story doesn't begin with a merger meeting. A state university dorm room is where it truly starts. A 19-year-old with a full academic scholarship, a second-hand laptop, and his mother's savings account number memorized by heart, sat down one evening and started mapping a problem that had been bothering him for 6 months. Structurally inefficient in ways accepted as simply the cost of doing business, that was the logistics industry. The movement of goods across complex, multi-node supply chains carried built-in waste, so old it had become invisible. Marcus saw it the way he had always seen things that weren't quite right, clearly, immediately, and with the irritation of someone who cannot understand why nobody has fixed it yet. 4 months of building followed 14-hour days. Instant noodles at midnight. A whiteboard covered entirely in mapping diagrams that his roommate described generously as looking like the evidence wall of a conspiracy thriller. Every Sunday, without fail, he called his mother not to talk about the work, because he didn't believe in it yet enough to say it out loud to someone who loved him, but just to hear her voice, to recalibrate, to remember what all of it was actually for. Adriana always knew when something was building. With Marcus, she knew before he said it. By junior year, the solution had a name, Pathline, and 3 beta clients who had agreed to test it on limited supply chains because one of Marcus's professors had made a single phone call to a contact who owed him a favor. Results from those 3 clients were, in the language of people who measure such things, statistically significant. Plain language version, Pathline worked better than anything currently on the market. At a fraction of the integration cost, with adaptability that existing enterprise systems couldn't touch, good things travel the way Pathline traveled. Not through marketing, but through the urgent conversation of people who have found something solving a real problem and cannot stop telling others. Graduating with 11 clients, a wait list of 37, and an inbox full of meeting requests from strangers, Marcus took none of the meetings for 2 months. Building the product better came first. More than anything else, That decision separated Marcus from the crowded field of young founders who understood the performance of building something without quite understanding the building itself. Pathline itself interested him, not the story of it. The distinction sounds small. In practice, it is the difference between something lasting and something that doesn't. Meridian Group found him at 21 through a mutual contact and offered a partnership structure that most founders twice his age would have signed without reading. Every page Marcus read, 4 clauses he negotiated, a contract attorney, a woman Celestine knew from church, one who charged a rate he could actually afford, reviewed the full document before Marcus signed a single line. Wednesday afternoon brought the call Adriana would never forget. Mom. Even at 21, even having built something real, even with the Forbes interview pending, his voice was still the voice of the boy at the kitchen table with the maths worksheet. You sitting down? Stirring soup, she said, which is basically the same thing. He laughed, that quick, real laugh that has never once sounded performed, and told her everything. The Meridian appointment, the acquisition lead role, the scope of the merger, what it meant for Pathline, what it meant for everything built since a dorm room and a second-hand laptop, and a problem that wouldn't leave him alone when somewhere between his words and her stirring. The universe held its breath. Unchanged in 22 years. That is what greeted Marcus when he walked onto the 43rd floor of Hale Consolidated's headquarters that Tuesday morning in November. Charcoal carpet, floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. The city spread below like something that belonged to someone. At the center, a long table capable of seating 20 occupied the room with the authority of furniture that has never once been questioned about its right to be where it is. Only one thing about the room differed from every other morning it had held power. Someone new sat at the head of it. Meridian Group's acquisition protocol was legally unambiguous. Marcus Hale Osi, as the appointed acquisition lead, held operational authority over all strategic decisions relating to the merger effective the date of signing. OSEP. Walking through those glass doors at 8:53, 7 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, he placed his leather briefcase on the table at the chair positioned at its head, the chair belonging to one man for 19 years, without hesitation, without apology, exactly where the contract said he should be. Filling quietly, the room arranged itself. Senior directors, department heads, legal counsel, the kind of assembled institutional power that take decades to accumulate and can, under the right circumstances, dissolve in a single fiscal quarter. Portfolios opened. Eyes traveled with varying degrees of discretion. Toward the young man at the head of the table, Marcus let them look. No performance of confidence came from him, none of the unnecessary movement, territorial arrangement of objects, or filling of silence with sound that belongs to people who don't actually possess it. Reviewing the last page of his document, he simply waited for 8 minutes past 9, with the patience of someone who had exactly the time necessary and none that wasn't. Dominic entered at 8:57 through the side door, connecting directly to his private office, allowing him to arrive already positioned rather than seen to be arriving. Charcoal suit, leather portfolio, the expression Adriana would have recognized immediately, evacuated behind his eyes. Professionally present, a man who had decided in advance how a meeting would go. Rounding the end of the table toward his usual seat, he looked up from his portfolio and stopped, just a cessation, not the dramatic kind from films, with gasps and stumbling and hands reaching for surfaces. A fraction of a second in which Dominic Hale's body understood something his mind hadn't caught up to, and declined to take another step until it had the eyes. That quality of stillness, the way the young man, at the head of his table, held the room without performing for it. Hit Dominic somewhere prehistoric and undeniable. Once before had he seen that quality of presence in a mirror 30 years ago, before the weight of everything built and lost replaced it with something more controlled and considerably less alive. Flashes of it he had seen since in photographs a private investigator found 11 years ago, photographs locked in a drawer and never opened again because looking at them too long did something he had no language for and was not willing to develop any, across a boardroom table now. In a man, his son, let me stop here and speak directly to you. Yes, you, watching this right now, wherever you are in the world. Think about what this room holds. Same glass, same altitude, same long table. 22 years ago, a woman sat in a chair deliberately positioned lower than everyone else's and was told her child was a problem to be managed. Today, that child sits at the head of that table, holding operational authority, reviewing documents, waiting with perfect patience for a meeting to begin. Nobody lowered his chair. Down Dominic sat, 3 places from the head, between the director of legal and the director of operations, a position requiring him to look slightly up and to his right to see the man running the meeting. Portfolio open, hands steady, face composed. But the room was not his anymore. Later, Meridian Group's internal acquisition report documented it as a highly efficient and professionally conducted strategic review session, 2 hours and 14 minutes, resulting in unanimous board alignment on the proposed restructuring framework. Exceptional command of both operational data and interpersonal dynamics of the room was noted of the acquisition lead. Absent from the report, the previous owner of that room spent 2 hours and 14 minutes sitting 3 seats from his unrecognized son, watching him dismantle and rebuild the architecture of everything Dominic had spent his life constructing. Calmly, precisely, without once raising his voice to be heard, missing from the report, Dominic's hands, steady throughout, were the hands of a man holding himself together from the inside, unrecorded entirely. Marcus at one point looked directly across the table, not with recognition, not with suspicion, just the clean, assessing look of an acquisition lead evaluating a senior stakeholder. And that look lasted approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which 22 years sat in the air between them, unspoken, unnamed sleep did not come. Tuesday night, not the familiar insomnia of the past decade, the formless 3 a.m., waking he had learned to manage with work and discipline and the willfulness of a man who refuses to be undone by his own mind. Different entirely, the sleeplessness of a man who had looked across a boardroom table at 22 years of consequence and understood, with a clarity no amount of control could soften, that the thing he had spent his adult life not quite thinking about had just walked into his building and taken the most important chair in it, confirmed by Thursday. Delivered by the private investigator, the same firm retained 11 years ago, when curiosity had become briefly unbearable before he locked those photographs away and chose not to know. A full report arrived in 48 hours. Full name: Marcus Adisa Hale Osei, born at Mercy General Hospital. Mother listed as Adriana Osei. Father listed on the birth certificate as unknown. Academic record, professional history, Pathline founding documentation. The Meridian Group appointment letter. Twice he read it. Face down on the desk it went. At the glass wall of his private office, looking out over the open plan floor where the acquisition team had set up a temporary working space, Dominic stood and watched his son work, moving between team members with the ease of someone who understood that leadership was not the performance of authority, but the creation of conditions in which people could do their best thinking. Marcus commanded without commanding, listening more than speaking. When words did come from him, people leaned slightly forward. Not because his voice was loud, because it was worth hearing. Longer than he would ever admit to anyone, Dominic stood at that glass wall. Naming what he felt with any single word proved impossible, which is perhaps why men like Dominic so rarely try. Pride arrived first, irrational, entirely unearned. The pride of recognizing something of yourself in another person while understanding completely you have no claim to it. Guilt came alongside, which he had been translating into other words for 22 years, and which now refused, at this glass wall, to be called anything other than what it was. Underneath both, quieter than either, something functioning like grief, the grief of a man who understands too late the precise shape of what he threw away. He had thrown away this. 4 draft letters written that evening, 4 deleted, not from lacking words. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Dominic was genuinely uncertain whether what he wanted mattered, whether wanting anything in this situation was even a category that applied, whether a man who had looked at a pregnant woman across a deliberately lowered chair with 3 lawyers present had forfeited, along with everything else, the right to want things from her son. Friday morning, through his executive assistant, he arranged the private meeting. Framed carefully as a mentorship conversation, his assistant made the call. Marcus's assistant confirmed the following Tuesday, 4 o'clock, 30 minutes. Without hesitation, Marcus agreed. Though one question came before confirming. Is there a specific agenda? Relayed to Dominic, the question sat in the room for a moment. Tell him, Dominic said finally, that I've been watching how he works, and I think there are things we should discuss. Most honest things said in 22 years. Also, as honest things sometimes are, not quite honest enough. Now, before I tell you what happens when these 2 men are finally alone in a room together, with no lawyers, no acquisition documents, and no professional framing to hide behind, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Hit that button right now, because what comes next is the conversation that 22 years of silence has been building toward, and you are not going to want to find out you missed it from someone else's comment section. Some of you watching have been on Marcus's side of this. Years of being excellent, building things, becoming things, doing the work, without knowing that somewhere, in a glass-walled office above you, someone who owed you an explanation was watching and calling it mentorship. You know that distance. The way it looks like interest from the outside and feels like something unfinished from the inside. Others watching have been on Dominic's side. Not the threat, not that part, but the standing at the glass wall, the deleted letters, the understanding arriving exactly late enough to be genuinely useless. The realization that the thing you cannot undo is not a concept, it is a person, running the meeting, having no idea who you are to them. Both of those truths are hard. Only one of them is just. For his part, Marcus noticed something about Dominic during those 2 hours in the boardroom that he hadn't found a framework for yet. That older man watched him with an attention feeling different from the other senior stakeholders in the room. Not hostile, not professionally assessing, something closer to recognition filed away. In that internal place. For later, coming back to my own voice after all of that, feels like walking through a door I didn't realize I had been standing outside of. Wednesday evening in November, I know because I had been watching the light change through my kitchen window the way I do in autumn. That late afternoon gold sitting in the room for about 20 minutes before disappearing completely, and I remember thinking I should call Celestine because 4 days without speaking to her was too long. Groundnut soup on the stove. Made the way my mother taught me, the way I taught Marcus when he was 9 years old, standing on a step stool at this same counter, far too confident about how much pepper was the right amount. My phone lit up on the counter. Marcus answering the way I always answer when it's him, not hello, just his name, the way you answer someone whose voice has brought you gladness every single time for 22 years without exception. Mom. That voice. Still the kitchen table. Still the maths worksheet. Still completely, entirely my son regardless of everything else he had become. You sitting down? Stirring soup, I said. Which is basically the same thing. That quick, real laugh, never once performed, and then everything came out. The Meridian appointment, the acquisition lead role, the scope of the merger, the size of the company, what it meant for Pathline, what it meant for everything built since a dorm room and a secondhand laptop and a problem that wouldn't leave him alone. Stirring the soup. Listening. Feeling that pride living somewhere between the sternum and the throat that has no adequate word in any language I have ever spoken. Then he said the name. It's a big one, Mom. Old industry, old money, Hale Consolidated. The wooden spoon stopped moving. Gracefully, I did not handle it. 22 years of building myself into someone harder, someone steadier, someone who had processed every part of that story. None of that preparation made the name land softly. It did not land softly, arriving the way it arrived the first time, on a phone screen, on a lunch break, in a life about to split into a before and after. Except this time the fault line ran directly through my son, proud and warm on the other end of this call, entirely unaware that the company he had just described as his greatest professional opportunity belonged to the man who had once sat across a deliberately lowered chair and told me his existence was a problem to be managed. Mom? That shift in his register, meaning he has heard something in my silence I did not intend to broadcast. You okay? Fine, I said. Voice completely steady. That I will tell you plainly because I am Adriana Osei and a long time ago in a penthouse boardroom on the 43rd floor of a building my son now controls. I learned how to keep everything underneath from showing. You sure? You went quiet. The soup, I said. It needed attention, accepted without question. Because he trusts me. Because 22 years of never lying to him directly, not the whole truth always, but never a direct lie, had built something between us capable of absorbing a single deflection without breaking. Holding on to that thought the way you hold what is nearest when the ground moves. After we hung up, standing at the stove for a long time, Riddy, the soup was. Eating it, I could not. Sitting at the kitchen table, same kind of table, different kitchen, same quality of evening light, when the day has asked too much. I put my hands flat on the surface, the way Dominic had once put his hands flat on a boardroom table and thought a gala. Marcus had mentioned it, a company welcome event. Meridian's formal introduction of the acquisition team to Hale Consolidated senior leadership. 4 days away. Both of them in the same room. My son and his father, the man who had said, keep that child, and I will leave you with nothing, and that child standing in a tailored suit with operational authority and absolutely no idea. 4 days to decide. 4 days to decide whether to keep the last secret, whether to call Marcus and say, there is something about that company, about that man, that you need to know before you walk into that room. Whether to finally say the name I had not once spoken inside any home I had made for us. Or whether to let the universe finish what it started. Because here is the third thing I never told anyone about Dominic Hale, the last of the 3 promises I made you at the beginning of this story. Watching him, I never stopped. Not obsessively, not with longing, not with anything that could be confused for unfinished feeling. The way you watch a storm system on the radar, not because you miss the rain, but because you need to know where it is at all times, the failed marriage I knew about, the board resignations, the insomnia his own PR team had accidentally referenced in a profile piece 3 years ago as his remarkable dedication to early morning work hours. Hiring a private investigator 11 years ago. That I knew about too, because I had hired one first. There is something I never told you about how this story ends. The gala happened. Both men were in that room, and what Adriana did with those 4 days, nobody saw coming. That story is in the next video stored. And watch it right now.